A Doll Called Peggaty, written and read by Christopher Halton. Amos Winryder lived with his wife Alice in their neat 3-bedroom terraced house in Acton, London. They had lived there for many years, and despite every effort to start a family, they had been very unlucky indeed. Countless visits for fertility treatment in the early years of the century had convinced doctors that Alice was infertile. Consequently, they resigned themselves to living quietly alone, doting upon their pet terrier Carnegie, whom they had adopted as a stray from the street. By 1920, both now in their early 60s, they were convinced that they would one day pass over with no heir or loved one to keep and live in their cherished little brick mortar and slate-tiled house, and all their memories would be scattered into the hands of scurrilous dealers at the behest of a solicitor engaged to dissolve their estate, such as it was. That was until shortly after Carnegie had died of old age, when their neighbour Marion Johnston appeared at their door with her 10-year-old daughter Florence in tow. Marion, a slim, attractive woman in her early 30s, had lived with Florence, or Flossie as she was called, in a similar but rented terraced house opposite them since the child was born. Marion, a typically jocular character of a kindly disposition, appeared fraught with worry, and asked to speak to Amos and Alice in private. The couple had no qualms about Marion or her daughter, and invited both into the house to speak. Flossie went to play with her doll in the garden on that hot July day, while Marion was invited to sit in the lounge with Amos, and Alice brought in a pot of tea with some freshly baked scones. Having all sat down together and having expressed the usual pleasantries of the day, Amos said to Marion in a kindly voice, "How can we help you, Marion?" He added, "If you don't mind me saying, you appear very upset by something that's troubling you." Marion sat at first very quiet and reserved, and holding the saucer in her hand, she sipped from her cup and said with an air of trepidation, "I don't know how to say this, but Alfred, my husband, has abandoned us and has moved away from the house with some other woman." She paused, put down her cup and saucer on the tray on the table, then wiped the gathering tears from the corners of her eyes, while Amos offered her a handkerchief which she used to dry the moisture on her cheeks before continuing. "Well, I can no longer afford to live in our home, as I need a job to support Flossie. And in that regard I need to travel to a family friend in Lancashire who has offered me a 6-month service role at a country estate near Preston, with an income that will allow me to return and rebuild my life. But Flossie cannot come with me. I'll be staying in the servants' quarters, and children aren't allowed. So I must ask from the bottom of my heart, would you look after her until my return? I shall be no longer than is necessary. I can give you all of her clothes and toys if you can. From the kindness of your heart, spare a bedroom for her." Alice sat quietly in shock and anticipation at the sound of children's laughter in their home, and readily replied excitedly, of course we can. Yes, we have a spare bedroom that will be perfect for her. Please don't worry about paying for food or board. We are more than willing to take her in." Amos, more than aware of his wife's enthusiasm, interjected, "But how will Flossie take it, Marion? She has lost her father and now she's losing you." She responded, "Flossie is quite grown up for her age, and she has lived in a house where a drunken brute, her father, resided. She will see this as heaven. She knows you both very well, and if you recall, she sometimes played with Carnegie, bless him." Amos sat quietly, pondering for a moment, and stroked his handlebar moustache, briefly rubbing his chin in deep contemplation. He muttered under his breath. He then straightened himself and said to both women, "Okay, let's go with that. But first we must ask Flossie ourselves what she actually wants." With that, Marion left the room and returned shortly afterwards with little Flossie, an adorable blonde-haired child in pigtails, who wore a one-piece checked dress, white socks and sandals. She was holding a wooden doll called Peggaty, who was dressed similarly. It was to the relief of all that Flossie was happy to stay. and despite the obvious sadness of not seeing her mother for a while, she was very excited when shown her room and around the house. It was evident that Flossie's home wasn't as well furnished or maintained as the Winryders', and this was mainly due to her father's alcoholism. He sold anything of value to support his selfish lifestyle. What was left was either old, worn out, or broken because of his heavy rages. The fact that he went with another woman must have been like a breath of air in poor Marion and Flossie's lives. But that was now all in the past, and the Winryders had to rebuild Flossie's life to make it as comfortable as possible during her mother's absence. Having helped move Flossie into her new temporary home, Marion and her daughter were left alone together to hug and talk before her impending journey to Lancashire later that evening. An hour later, Marion departed by cab and would not be seen for many months, although she promised to write regularly and to send whatever spare cash she had for Flossie's benefit. The first few weeks of Flossie's new life with the Winryders were not without their problems, as Flossie was readjusting to a new, more pleasant life, but sadly without her mother's guidance. Marion did write regularly and sent cash by postal order, which the Winryders used to buy new clothes and toys for little Flossie, although her crudely made doll Peggaty was inseparable from her. In the months that followed, all were progressing well, and Flossie addressed Amos and Alice as her uncle and aunt. But despite the apparent joy and happiness, a dark and ominous cloud lay ahead on the horizon in the form of her father, who had returned to reclaim his daughter. He arrived on their doorstep one late September evening, quite drunk and very belligerent, demanding to see his daughter. The Winryders tried their best to reason with him, and in the commotion caused by the swaggering brute screaming and shouting, Flossie appeared in the tiled hallway in her nightdress, holding her doll. Very calmly she said to her father, "I no longer wish to live with you, Papa. This is my home, and Peggaty wants rid of you." With that, her father, Alfred Davies, stopped silent for a moment, laughed hysterically at his daughter's suggestion, and said, "I'll be back in the morning, young lady. You will come with me to stay at your new home with your new mother." He turned, unable to balance himself, and using the front door frame, propelled himself onto the street, where he was last seen staggering down the pavement, guided by the gaslights fringing the road. The Winryders were shocked. They had never expected Davies to turn up on their doorstep, and even less to reclaim control of poor Flossie. But Flossie was quite unperturbed. She smiled as she turned upstairs to return to her room, and said in parting, "Please don't worry, Auntie and Uncle. Peggaty knows we won't be seeing him again." With that, she went to her room and closed the door. The Winryders chuckled among themselves, and Alice said, "Oh, I do wish that to be so, bless her." They thought no more about it and went to bed. The following day the morning newspaper arrived through the letterbox, and Amos sat down at the breakfast table, glancing through it while Alice prepared breakfast. 2 pages in was a reported death of a man who was allegedly pushed in front of a bus 2 streets from where they lived. A cold chill ran down Amos's spine when the deceased's name was given as Alfred Davies. Without saying a word, he took the paper to Alice as she was cooking on the stove and pointed to the entry. She stopped, read it, and both turned to each other in silent shock. "Surely it cannot be," said Alice. "Undoubtedly it is," said Amos. "It says the deceased was drunk and tripped on the curb into the path of a red double-decker. It has to be him." "My God," said Alice. "Can you check with the police before I break the news to Flossie?" "No need to tell me," said Flossie, who had arrived behind them in the kitchen. "Peggaty told me last night." Both looked behind, and there stood Flossie with her old wooden doll. She had a pleased told-you-so smile. Amos, feeling very uncomfortable, said to Flossie, "Now, my dear, I know your daddy wasn't a very pleasant chap, but even so, if it was him, he was, after all said and done, your father." Flossie then held up the doll and said, "Peggaty told me he was a bad man, and she went out last night and pushed him in front of the bus. Peggaty said that all evil men must be punished for their bad deeds, because Peggaty was once hurt by bad men a long time ago, and Peggaty does not like bad people. Despite all that Flossie said, both Amos and Alice felt that she must have overheard them talk about it, or perhaps had even read the report in the newspaper before Amos removed it from the letterbox. Of course, both explanations were nonsense, and they knew it. But how did the child know? Amos decided from that moment to learn more about the doll and wrote a letter to Marion, explaining the sudden demise of her husband and asking whether she could throw any light on where Flossie had acquired the doll. A week later, a reply was received in the post from Marion. She was shocked to read of Alfred's demise, and in answer to the question about the doll, explained that it had been given to Flossie 2 years earlier by an old gypsy lady who lived in a caravan on the fringes of Barnet Gate, a rural area on the edge of the city, around an hour away from Acton. She had travelled there with a friend for a day's outing with Flossie, and their car had broken down by a small gypsy cluster of horse-drawn Vardo caravans. It was there that one of the gypsy men had fixed the car while Marion, Flossie and their friend were invited to sit inside this old lady's Vardo nearby, where they drank tea. Her name was Old Nan, and she was a mystic. She gave Flossie the doll as a gift. Amos decided to take a drive in his Morris Cowley over to Barnet Gate in the hope of finding this gypsy woman. After a relatively uneventful journey, he arrived in the area and quickly discovered a gypsy encampment lying on the edge of some fields. Sure enough, as described in Marion's letter, he found the caravan, which was brightly coloured red and beautifully painted with gold designs. The Vardo sat on the back of a wagon, with worn wooden steps leading up to an open-ended door from which an elderly woman smoked a clay pipe while sitting on a stool. She saw Amos approach and smiled. "You've come about Peggaty, haven't you?" she said. Taken aback, Amos replied, "Yes, how on earth did you know that?" She replied, "I know many things, some good and some bad. You'd better come inside." With that, she got to her feet. She wore an old-fashioned long-flared dress made from coloured strips of different cloth. She wore a number of charms on her arms and neck, and had a dark brown complexion, her skin looking like worn old leather. She was slightly overweight and in her early 80s, although very sprightly for her age. Her long grey hair was tied into a headscarf, and while holding the clay pipe, she beckoned Amos to sit on a narrow bench inside. Once seated, she stared intently at Amos for a minute or two. Her eyes scanned every facet of his face, as though looking for some intangible clue. She then said, "You are a good man, and you live with your wife, looking after the little girl, Flossie. What you seek is where I got the old doll I gave her." She grinned with a knowing smile and added, "Let me explain. I knew about her father and gave her Peggaty to protect her from harm. If I had not, she would have died with her father in an accident if he had returned to collect her in the morning. Peggaty stopped that." She then puffed a little on her pipe and said, "Do you believe in witchcraft?" Amos replied, somewhat confused as to where this conversation was going. "I believe others in the past believed in witchcraft, and I know many innocent women and some men were falsely accused and put to death." She raised her eyebrows. "Well, we witches exist. I am a witch, or whatever label society would affix to me. I am a good witch, but others are bad. Peggaty was a witch, burned at the stake in the 17th century. The doll was carved from wood that escaped the flames, and within it her soul still lingers. I swore she would protect the child." Amos angrily interjected, "But to kill that brute was evil, do you not think?" "Peggaty was a good woman in life. She used her powers to help. But she was murdered by Matthew Hopkins, the so-called witch-finder general, and he was evil." She paused to regain composure as she was becoming quite agitated and continued, "You can only fight fire with fire, and if anyone harms Flossie or becomes a problem, then Peggaty will act." Amos was annoyed by old Nan's logic in justifying crimes in pursuit of self-perceived justice and said, "I could have dealt with that drunk myself without magical charms. I want to return the doll to you, as Flossie is now safe with Alice, my wife, and me, and we are starting to love her as a daughter. The longer she keeps this doll, the greater the risk that Flossie will be corrupted by it." Old Nan smiled cynically. "But she has to give up the doll willingly to get rid of it. Nothing else will do." Although both agreed to disagree, there was no animosity, and shortly afterwards Amos returned home, where he shared his encounter with old Nan. Alice, too, was very perturbed, and they both agreed that Flossie's attitude had changed somewhat since the death of her father. She was becoming more self-assured in a way that made the Winryders feel very uncomfortable. As the weeks progressed into winter's cold, Flossie became more dominant and demanding than ever before. In fact, the Winryders were becoming fearful of her, careful with their words when speaking to her. One night they were awakened from their sleep by the barking of a small dog in their bedroom. The barking sounded screechy and weak, but as they turned on their bedside light, there stood on the carpet the half-rotted remains of their dog, Carnegie, who had been buried many months ago in their back garden. Half of his face was missing, exposing his canine jaws. Patches of fur lay scattered on the carpet, and his eyes were exposed from their sockets, worms wriggling from the bare patches of his body. The stench was appallingly bad, and yet here was a very rotted but apparently animated corpse of their beloved pet brought back from the grave, as they suspected, by Peggaty for nefarious reasons, because Amos questioned old Nan. Standing in the dimly lit corner of the bedroom was a grey shade in the form of a woman, and from there came the most devilish laugh they had ever heard. As the figure and laughter faded away, the corpse of Carnegie also disappeared, and the vile stench dissipated from the room. Amos immediately leapt from his bed and very quietly entered Flossie's bedroom. All he saw was Flossie lying fast asleep, cuddling the wooden doll which, although crudely made, now bore a cut mark on its face similar to a human smile. Enough was enough. Amos was compelled, now and forever, to deal with this monster of evil that possessed this poor child. Quietly taking the doll from the arms of the deeply asleep child, he dressed quickly and wrapped the doll in a cloth, which he then placed securely in the trunk of his car. Alice agreed to remain with the child while he drove for an hour back to old Nan's caravan. During the journey he could hear what sounded like a fully grown woman screeching and snarling, trying to kick open the trunk door. This hellish screaming lasted for the duration of the journey, and he was thankful it was in the middle of the night, as nobody could hear this dreadful crying, which surely would have attracted the police. Eventually he arrived at the encampment, and the screaming and kicking ceased. Cautiously he went to the trunk, expecting to find a fully formed woman, but instead found the wooden doll as he had left it. Fortunately there was a metal brazier still containing hot ash, and he threw the doll onto it. It quickly burst into flame with the cackling sound of a woman screaming coming from the fire. As the doll burst into flame, he saw the door flung open on old Nan's caravan. She too was aflame and ran out across to the brazier to save herself and the doll, but it was too late. She collapsed into a heap as the fire quickly consumed her entire body, which went out as her body turned to ash. The most inexplicable thing was that nobody in the encampment was disturbed, and the brazier quickly returned to dull, hot ash. Old Nan's ashes were blown away in a short, sharp gust of wind that disappeared back into stillness. It was as though some other force had decided to protect Amos from harm, and he was then able to return home without incident. The following morning at breakfast, Flossie sat down at the table and happily ate her food without mentioning Peggaty. As for old Nan, she was never heard of again, despite being reported missing to the police. Within a few months, Marion returned to collect Flossie, as she had been promoted to a senior estate position that included a home and the doll was never mentioned again. Although childless once more, sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Alice swore she could hear a child's laughter flicker in the embers of the fire, which gave a sense of comfort to them both. The Winryders, however, kept in regular contact with Marion and Flossie, and were honoured to be invited to Lancashire 10 years later to rejoice in Flossie's marriage to a young estate employee, with whom they eventually raised their own family. The end.